Okay, there's a short introduction for more to come, possibly in the future if I can contact some people. Nicaragua is going through a few convulsions, yet to be determined whether this will lead to a change in government there. Now, when when you guys follow my channel, you might notice that I have the Testigo Venezuela series of videos. I also did a lot of videos on Catalonia, by the way. I ought to check in on what's going on there. I know that they had an election, but one of the things that I think is underemphasized in U.S. foreign policy is Latin America. It could be Venezuela, could be Cuba, could be some of the other countries that are a little less troubled. Argentina, which could go through some trouble in the near future due to pension debt, something we should be worried about here. And Peru, I'm gonna have to check on that. But Nicaragua, for those of you that don't know, is ruled by basically a communist era dictator named Daniel Ortega. And President Ortega, well, he was elected most recently democratically, but in reality, his attitude is a holdover from the communist era. He was Nicaragua's communist leader during the 1980s, and then he was removed, I think, in 1991 in a democratic election and replaced by Violeta Chamorro. I think, well, it was a democratic election, so he lost, and he went and probably grew some plants in the ensuing 2 decades, and then he came back, and now he's president again. And the truth is that Nicaragua, it's not as blessed as some of the other countries around it. There's not the strategic importance of Panama. You don't have the stability and commercial viability of Costa Rica. I'd say that they're ahead of Guatemala. Guatemala, I've heard, is a pretty miserable place to live. But this is a person, he's had how many chances to really lead his country into the modern era, and he's failed. He could have absorbed the failures of his time as the communist leader, which was from like 1979 through 1990. Okay, here's a backstory. Nicaragua was for many years a banana republic, basically beholden to the U.S. Our interests kind of drove what was going on there. We backed some bad dictators, the Somozas. There was Anastasio Somoza Garcia, and then his son Luis, and then his other son, who was Luis's brother, Anastasio Somoza Debayle, because that's how it works down there. So basically, for all intents and purposes, Nicaragua was like a branch of the U.S. foreign policy in Latin America, run by the same family, the Somozas. And eventually, because they kept stealing from the country's treasury, there was an earthquake in 1972, and they stole all the aid, and the country never recovered. The Sandinista National Liberation Front, which attained like worldwide fame. There was an album by the Pretenders called Sandinista. They went and they took over after a violent revolution, which was pretty remarkable. Given the fact that they, you can talk about Cuban and Soviet aid, but they were, during the entire Nicaraguan revolution and civil war, they were outgunned by the government, the National Guard led by Somoza. And then they take over, and a lot of the people who had opposed Somoza immediately saw some of the same elements of authoritarianism in Ortega and the FSLN, the Sandinistas, and they split off and became the Contras. Some of them were in all honesty, they were ex-National Guard anyway. I think the main leader's name was Adolfo Calero. It's been years since I read about this, and that guy was never really against Somoza. He basically was a remnant of his. So there was the Contras fighting Ortega and the Sandinistas for most of the 80s. And then he basically yielded power in, what was it? Yeah, it was 1990 to Chamorro after she beat him in elections. And that's it. He goes on a hiatus, comes back in 2007, and has become kind of an autocratic dictator. Now the impetus for the current protests is largely because they've been having to make a lot of cutbacks. They're having to raise taxes. They're having to raise the amount of I think they're actually decreasing the payouts for Social Security. People are going nuts because this is exactly the opposite of what his policies had he had promised. He promised that people would be able to work less, um, you know, own more, have more equality, and have an old age pension, all that stuff. And it's just not coming true. And indeed, I have a couple links available. Not too much information on this yet, but people are just bugging out over there. It says more protests and clashes broke out Thursday in Nicaragua over a planned Social Security reform, and the government ordered off the air 5 independent TV channels that have been covering the unrest. A day after the disturbances began in the capital, Managua, and in Leon, they spread to 3 other cities, Esteli, Masaya, and Granada. I can tell you that in the past, I don't know if it's still the same way, because I don't think I've read much about Nicaragua since 20 years ago, which gives you an idea of how much of a nerd I was in 7th grade. So Granada and Leon are the 2 second cities of Nicaragua. They're basically the centers of social power. At the National Agrarian University in Managua, a student protester lost an eye in clashes after riot police arrived to quell the demonstration. Several people were seen being detained in video images transmitted by media not controlled by the government and social networks, though police have not given official figures on arrests. At least 8 people were injured Wednesday. On Thursday, those channels went dark after authorities ordered cable companies to cut their signal. In a Facebook post, Channel 15 director Miguel Mora called the action by President Daniel Ortega's government a clear violation of freedom of the press. We reiterate our commitment to the people and to the truth, Mora said, adding that the station would continue to broadcast online. Channels 12, 14, 23, and 51, the last of which belonged to the Roman Catholic Church, were also censored. Vice President and First Lady Rosario Murillo, accused the protesters of being manipulated and trying to destabilize and destroy the country. She defended the Social Security measures as beneficial to the poorest. The overhaul increases income and payroll taxes and makes changes to pensions to try to shore up Nicaragua's troubled Social Security system. Now, I want to tell people, the usual excuse here when you tell people, well, this socialism experiment isn't working, and this is in a third world country, what they'll usually say is, well, the real troublemakers are the rich of that country. Well, if the country is so rich and there's all these rich people down there, then how come nevertheless there's a ton of people who flee to our country? Why is it our country, the U.S., that has to shoulder the burden of the poor people of that country? Because logically, Nicaragua's been run for 11 years now by Ortega, again, for the second time, and he's basically run it into the ground. And who you're going to blame? You're going to blame rich Venezuelans and hoarders and international banking, like you always do, capital and whatever. You want people first economics. They're rejecting people's first economics. If you come to the point, this is why I always say, socialism has actual no moral ground, because if you always come to the point where you have to shut down 5 TV stations in order for people not to hear about these protests that are coming to tear down your system, then your system is not worth trying. It just isn't. You promise equality, you promise equity, and then you fail. And what are we supposed to do? Just let you try again and again and again? People are suffering from it. They're dying. In many cases, these old people that have already suffered from your crap the first time, now they have to go through it again. That's not the way human progress is supposed to work. There are countries that go through the same type of nonsense over and over again, and those countries never become truly successful on the world stage. That's what's happened in Venezuela, not Venezuela, in Nicaragua. Sorry, Venezuela's, to some degree, in a much worse state than Nicaragua. But another issue is that because they were allies, the Latin America has a number of states that are, I think they're called the ALBA bloc, and those include, here, I'll tell you in a second. ALBA. For the Alianza Boliviana para los Pueblos de Nuestras Americas. So that's ALBA. So you have Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, Cuba, and what do you call it? Nicaragua. And for some reason they include, so that this is a block of nations that, how there's blocks of nations like the Eastern Bloc and the Warsaw Pact, which is the same thing. But so this one has official languages. For some reason they threw in Quechua and Aymara, which are the two alternative languages of Ecuador, but it really doesn't really do anything for them. And they at one point wanted to create a common currency, which it might be that it's better that it didn't happen. But look, I think it's going to fall apart. It probably will, because of the money drying up that used to come from Venezuela to the other countries, Nicaragua and Cuba. Well, it wasn't always money. Sometimes it was oil. It is going to basically fall apart now that it doesn't have that extra juice from Venezuela. Venezuela can barely, it can't pay its own bills. It's actually falling apart in a much more catastrophic way than Nicaragua. And that might be what ends up tearing down the Nicaraguan regime, because up until now, possibly Nicaragua could claim, oh, we're able to survive or whatever, because for many years they lived off the high hog, as Venezuela was benefiting from high oil prices, and they did have surpluses because oil was so expensive. Now, no, it's the opposite. They can't depend on Venezuela at all. Venezuela is basically falling more and more out of the realm of an independent state, and can't help Nicaragua or Cuba with free oil or anything. It's barely them pumping oil, and they have the largest oil reserves in the world. So that's about it. Let me know what you think. Hope it doesn't get as bad as Venezuela. But if Ortega could fall from power, you could see the final death knell of Venezuela. The more isolated they get, the more in the middle of a sea of opposition they are in South America, the less likely they'll be able to continue to operate. And there will probably be some sort of internal reordering or coup, golpe de estado, as they say down there, and that's it. You might have both Nicaragua and Venezuela drift out of the totalitarian orbit in the next couple years. Cuba, not so much. They just switched their president. We'll talk about that at a different time. That's it. This is Bold Like a Leopard, and have a great Friday.